after Blair stepped down, he took on this role for the Quartet and has never stopped pushing both sides towards the negotiating table. It hasn't worked, but it does mean that Blair comes with a pretty well unique length of experience of dealing with this problem. Certainly among British prime ministers, he's the only one I knew who really put effort into it. I suppose the only other person with an equivalent kind of experience is Netanyahu, actually. And the two men know each other well. Of course, Blair also knows all the Gulf leaders from his time in power and then his business dealings out there. So, no, he hasn't pulled it off, nor has anybody else. But he does come to it with a remarkable depth of experience and this continued conviction that something has to be possible if you can get the two sides around the negotiating table. Now, Gaza might be the time when he can apply that hands-on. We'll see. But I don't think people should kind of rule him out from scratch because of the baggage he brings from the past.
The Trump-Blair plan for peace in Gaza has provided a real boost to the chances of perhaps bringing an end to the conflict in Gaza, which has been going on, the conflict, for 2 years, starting with the October 7th attacks on Israel. Hamas have said that they will release the remaining hostages subject to certain conditions being met. If the plan goes ahead, Tony Blair has been suggested by the Trump administration as a member of the Board of Peace that would oversee the rebuilding and governance of Gaza after the terror group has gone. And from Iraq to Afghanistan, Tony Blair's record in the region is deep and spotty, perhaps, in the view of many. So we thought we'd open up the archive and look at the former Prime Minister's relationship with politics in the Middle East. And joining us to do that is Lord Ricketts, Peter Ricketts, former head of the Diplomatic Service, who was the policy director for the Foreign Office during the Iraq War. Hello to you.
Hello, Adam.
Let's start with 1998. Now, that was the year of the Good Friday Agreement. And I remember accompanying the Prime Minister in the press pack when he went out to the Middle East, both to Israel and to the Palestinian territories, feeling perhaps that he did have something to offer. Here he is speaking when visiting the Shati refugee camp. This sound courtesy of Associated Press.
I don't have an immediate solution on the problem of the refugees, but I think everyone recognises there's going to have to be some form of accommodation. Otherwise, there isn't really a settlement at all, because there are literally hundreds of thousands of people in different places who have refugee status at the moment, and there are difficulties both for the host country and for others too. So, again, I believe that can be dealt with, provided there is sufficient goodwill there to make sure that it is.
Peter Ricketts, he really did have, messianic is unfair, but he did feel that he could contribute something to making peace after his experiences in Northern Ireland, didn't he?
Yeah, Blair is someone, of acute convictions. And I think the convictions he holds are absolutely genuine. They sometimes change over time. And as you say, he came into this from the success of the negotiations in Northern Ireland. And also remember, scrolling back to the 1990s, this was a period where peace between Israel and Palestinians did look possible. We'd had the Oslo Accords with Tony Blair's friend Clinton absolutely at the center of things. And then we'd had the Wye River agreements with a certain Israeli prime minister called Benjamin Netanyahu, already in 1998 Prime Minister of Israel. And so this was a period where these negotiations were going on. There were signing ceremonies on the White House lawn. And I think Blair, with his close relationship with Clinton and his passionate belief in the capacity of himself and of the power of negotiation, thought this was a problem that he should and could tackle.
What was the problem? Why did those moves, particularly by the Americans and also, as you say, with the Oslo process, why did they founder?
Well, in the end, they could never be brought to a head at a time when both sides were really prepared to take a risk for peace. So when Rabin was Prime Minister of Israel at the time of the Oslo Accords, Arafat was his counterpart. And in the end, I think Arafat wasn't prepared to do a deal. Same was true at this Wye River meeting in America, where again, Clinton pressed both sides very hard. But it always came down to issues of the refugees, what would happen if there was to be an independent Palestinian state to the Israeli settlers, the settlements on the West Bank. And would a Palestinian state be a genuine state? Was Israel feeling secure enough to permit that? So even at that time, there was a fundamental lack of trust between the Israelis and Arafat and the PLO, who were then in charge of things on the Palestinian side. And even Clinton, at the height of his powers, could never quite bring both sides to take the risk for peace at the same time.
Now, what totally transformed the mood in the wider Middle East, of course, were the 9/11 attacks in 2001 on America. And that led, in due course, rightly or wrongly, to the American-led invasion of Afghanistan and then of Iraq. Let's listen to Tony Blair talking about Iraq, that invasion in 2003 and British involvement.
On Tuesday night, I gave the order for British forces to take part in military action in Iraq. Tonight, British servicemen and women are engaged from air, land and sea. Their mission? To remove Saddam Hussein from power and disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction. I know this course of action has produced deep divisions of opinion in our country, but I know also the British people will now be united in sending our armed forces our thoughts and prayers. They are the finest in the world, and their families and all of Britain can have great pride in them.
What would you say, Lord Ricketts, to people who say that commitment, shoulder to shoulder with the Americans by Tony Blair really disqualifies him from any idea of being a peacemaker in the Middle East?
Well, I think I'd say two things. First of all, as I said, he was a man of intense conviction, and he became completely convinced that there were these weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that if terrorists got their hands on them, then 9/11 would have seemed a sideshow to the kind of attacks that they could have delivered against Western countries. It turned out to be wrong, and that's been a fateful decision that has been the albatross around his neck. The other thing I'd say is that, yes, he made that decision. He also then lived the post-conflict transition period and the terrible mess that the American-led coalition provisional authority under an American called Paul Bremer made of those crucial first months in Iraq. And I think he learned from that. So in terms of someone who has lived through a bitter experience of trying to build peace after conflict and then transferring that experience to Gaza, I think people might make allowances for the fact that this man comes to it with some very relevant experience, and he wouldn't make the same mistakes again that he and the Americans made in the post-conflict in Iraq.
And perhaps part of learning those lessons was that when he left office in 2007, he became the envoy of the Quartet, then made up of Europe, the UK, the United Nations and Russia, with the task of developing the Palestinian economy. That was between 2007 and 2015. Here he is speaking to Al Jazeera after the Quartet approved a peace plan and said Middle East peace was now in the hands of Israel and the Palestinians.
The next step following the Quartet statement that was issued just a couple of hours ago is for the parties to meet within a month. Within 3 months, we've now said that they should present comprehensive proposals on borders and security. Within 6 months, make substantial progress on all issues, and the aim is to get a framework agreement not later than the end of next year. So the next step, if you like, alongside obviously what the Palestinians have done at the United Nations, is to get a negotiation going and for the parties actually to put on the table something so that they see the proposals of each other.
Mr. Blair, have both sides agreed to that timetable?
We're going to have to wait and see. The Quartet's agreed, the international community's agreed.
Didn't really get anywhere, though, did it, Lord Ricketts?
No, but you have to give the guy some credit for trying. I mean, most prime ministers after 10 years in office want to go and have a break for a time after leaving office. The next day after Blair stepped down, he took on this role for the Quartet and has never stopped trying, pushing both sides towards the negotiating table. It hasn't worked, but it does mean that Blair comes with a pretty well unique length of experience of dealing with this problem. Certainly among British prime ministers, he's the only one I knew who really put effort into it. I suppose the only other person with an equivalent kind of experience is Netanyahu, actually. And the two men know each other well. Of course, Blair also knows all the Gulf leaders from his time in power and then his business dealings out there. So, no, he hasn't pulled it off, nor has anybody else. But he does come to it with a remarkable depth of experience and this continued conviction that something has to be possible if you can get the two sides around the negotiating table. Now, Gaza might be the time when he can apply that hands-on. We'll see. But I don't think people should kind of rule him out from scratch because of the baggage he brings from the past.
But he did still have the baggage of Iraq. And in 2016, when the Chilcot report came out, which said that preparations for war had been inadequate and that all options for peace had not been explored, Mr. Blair remained defiant, defending his actions.
The intelligence assessments made at the time of going to war turned out to be wrong. The aftermath turned out to be more hostile, protracted and bloody than ever we imagined. The coalition planned for one set of ground facts and encountered another. And a nation whose people we wanted to set free and secure from the evil of Saddam became instead victim to sectarian terrorism. For all of this, I express more sorrow, regret and apology than you may ever know or can believe. Only two things I cannot say. It's claimed by some that by removing Saddam we caused the terrorism today in the Middle East and that it would have been better to have left him in power. I profoundly disagree. Saddam was himself a wellspring of terror, a continuing threat to peace and to his own people. If he had been left in power in 2003, then I believe he would once again have threatened world peace, and when the Arab revolutions of 2011 began, he would have clung to power with the same deadly consequences that we see in the carnage in Syria today. Whereas at least in Iraq, for all its challenges, we have today a government that is elected, is recognised as internationally legitimate, and is fighting terrorism with the support of the international community. The world was and is, in my judgment, a better place without Saddam Hussein.
Now, of course, British personnel were killed in the invasion of Iraq, and it remains, as well as a great many people in Iraq, it remains very contentious for us here in this country as far as Mr. Blair's record is concerned. Sorry, Sir Tony's record is concerned. But Lord Ricketts, what do they think about Tony Blair in the region rather than here?
I mean, I'm not a specialist, but you heard there the conviction of the man who will never accept that his judgment was wrong in going into Iraq. But I think you also heard there some recognition of the lessons that he learned from the post-conflict experience. I think the answer to your question is among the elites, among the Gulf rulers, he is well regarded. He's still seen as a friend of many of these countries over the years. I think probably on the Arab street, there are those bitter memories of the Iraq War, of the sectarian violence that triggered off, of the many thousands who died in Iraq and around the region, as well as British and other troops during that war. I mean, they will not forgive him for that. So we have a choice here. Do we accept somebody who has got the track record and the lived experience that can bring something to bear in trying to get a transition going in Gaza? Or do we rule him out, on principle because of what happened in the aftermath of the Iraq invasion? I mean, that's very much a judgment people have to make. But I think among the street, there is no great love for Tony Blair in the Arab world. I think that would be the short way of putting it.
One of the things, though, about Sir Tony Blair is his irrepressible optimism, even on the future in the Middle East. Here he is a couple of years ago being asked about the prospect of peace.
It could easily be revived. I mean, I always say the difference between the Northern Ireland peace process and the Israeli-Palestinian one is that in Northern Ireland we were able to achieve peace, but without an agreement as to what the final outcome. There's still a difference of opinion. The Unionists want Northern Ireland. In the UK, the Nationalists want it united with the south of Ireland. Whereas in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the irony is there is an agreement amongst most reasonable people that you need to have a two-state solution, but it's the circumstances that make that extremely difficult to negotiate. And I have come to the conclusion over a number of years, and when I go back to the Middle East soon, it'll be I think 270th visit since leaving office. So I've been there a lot, and I'm deep in the politics of the region. And I think you're only going to get peace now if you can create the circumstances of genuine cultural acceptance.
And what is interesting, Lord Ricketts, is that Donald Trump seems to have shifted from a position of basically backing Netanyahu and Israel all out towards a 20-point peace plan, which does recognise the possible outcome of a two-state solution, something which, quite clearly Tony Blair's always been committed to.
Yeah, and I do see Blair's fingerprints on this 20-point plan, quite honestly. As you say, I think there's a case for a bit of optimism in diplomacy. It's too easy to wash hands of affair, leave things as bad as they are. Blair's always been prepared to have a go and try. And I think the thing that he has helped to convince Trump of is that you cannot simply deal with Gaza in the sort of real estate way of inviting yourself in, getting rid of the Gaza population of Palestinians, rebuilding the place and turning it into a Riviera. And he's made Trump recognize, I think, that a solution has to pass by accepting that the Palestinians have rights and that they need to have some sort of political perspective, one day even a Palestinian state. And those words are in the 20-point plan, although Netanyahu denies that they're there. So I think Blair has had some kind of influence with his friend Jared Kushner, son-in-law of Donald Trump, in bringing him to accept that there are two sides to this. It can't simply be achieved by backing the Israelis. And if he wants the Nobel Peace Prize, which he clearly does, then he has got to find a way of bringing the two sides to the table and recognizing that the Palestinians have to have some sort of hope for the future. And that's a Blair-shaped problem, I think, that he's tackling.
Lord Ricketts, thank you very much indeed. Well, we shall see where this peace process goes and what role Tony Blair does or does not have in it. Thank you again.